This week, we're going to dive into Module 10 and talk about The Watchmen. So, The Watchmen is considered to be one of the groundbreaking works. Watchmen is considered to be one of the groundbreaking comic works of the 20th century. So, we're going to talk about that particular phenomenon. So, for all of its acclaim and detailed analyses of its 9-panel structure and how Shakespearean it is, don't read into this stuff, whatever you do, because they just dive way too deeply into it. 9-panel structure is a very common, ancient comic form, and the fact that Watchmen uses it is really not that big of a deal, but they talk about it a lot if you want to read about that. So Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' Watchmen started out as a comic. It was not a graphic novel because those didn't really exist yet. It was a 12-issue series published in 1986 and 1987. And originally DC planned for Moore to use Charlton Comics characters that DC bought in 1983 in the same way they bought the Fawcett characters, until they saw what Moore actually planned to do with them, which was to kill and mangle most of them so they couldn't be used in any DC continuities. So they asked that he use original characters instead. So note to prospective comic writers out there, this is a really good tactic if you don't want to get saddled with tired and forgotten characters like the ones we studied back in Module 6. So what is Watchmen and why is it so damned important? Well, one thing, it's a meta-critique of comics, superheroes, and American history, and forms a cataclysmic dividing line between everything that came before and everything after. That's all it is, really. It formed the idea of the graphic novel and inspired lots of industry outsiders to break from ranks and create their own characters and stories and publish them in short runs, which we're going to get into in Module 12. And then when compiled, all that fits nicely into a hardcover book, thus called a graphic novel. It's also a damn good read, jam-packed with brilliant and troubling ideas that unbelievably was published by DC Comics in the mid-'80s, which was a good time for big hair, drum machines, and BMX bikes, but not a whole lot else. And this comic kind of showed up in the middle of all that. Fortunately, all of you are way too young to remember that, most of you. Getting into specifics, it importantly skewers the idea of costume vigilantes and superheroes, of which Watchmen contains exactly one. So what do vigilantes do? They perform extrajudicial justice in wacky costumes. And they also aren't necessarily good people with good intentions. So Exhibit A, the comedian. If a person actually did develop godlike superhuman powers, would they retain a sense of humanity and feel duty-bound to protect humans? Of course not. In reality, with great power comes great apathy. So how would the smartest man in the world save humanity from itself? By committing an unspeakable horror that stuns the populace into forgetting itself for a brief moment. The outlines of the characters and stories are familiar, but the outcomes are very, very different. So at one point, Alan Moore was regarded as one of the most important writers in comics. If Watchmen wasn't enough, V for Vendetta, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and From Hell are enough to cement some form of legacy. But in recent years, his more eccentric tendencies have taken center stage, as well as his displeasure with cinematic depictions of his work, pushing him further from the limelight. At any rate, his work opened the door for many younger authors with edgy visions and independent spirits. Grant Morrison, the author of the textbook, Mark Miller, who I'm constantly referring to, could be counted among those. And he helped usher in the modern age of comics. So for the film, this was also directed by Zack Snyder, who did Man of Steel and has his fingerprints on all the DC stuff. It was written by David Hayter and Alex C., more or less verbatim from the comic, but with a few notable changes that I'll get into below in this. So this is part of Snyder's early career, which I consider there's pre-Sucker Punch and post-Sucker Punch, when he was at his best doing comic adaptations. Although it makes one notable change in the ending, which doesn't not work, but it's still kind of puzzling. This film is a slavish attempt to recreate the comic, which is a good thing. And visually, this is very successful. Dramatically, not so much. And it did lead to a career renaissance for Jackie Earle Haley, who was a former child and kind of teen star in 80s movies, and features an unsung performance by Jeffrey Dean Morgan, before he put on a motorcycle jacket, red bandana, and grabbed a barbed wire wrapped baseball bat. But as you can see, he specializes in anti-heroes. So the comic origin, I don't really need to get into that and talk about it, so I've provided some comic panels here because the movie looks so much like the comic, and you'll actually see a fair number of shots in the film that are taken directly from the comic, which is basically like a storyboard waiting to be turned into a movie. So the synopsis, after a former costume vigilante is murdered, Rorschach enlists the help of his former associates, Dr. Manhattan and Night Owl II, to help uncover the fiendish plot to kill anyone with knowledge of the even more fiendish plot to prevent World War III. And although that synopsis would not make anyone want to see the movie, it contains almost no spoilers. And I know I'm kind of bad at spoilers. I apologize for that. So Connected Works, there's also the HBO series, which kind of mimics the delivery of the comic by being divided into 9 episodes. Remember, 9 equal frames, and being finite. Obviously, Alan Moore was not involved in any way, shape, or form, but the series is exceptionally strong and does rectify the meaning of the original Watchmen ending, which it brings the squids back. The fact that it takes a few of the original characters, Ozymandias, Dr. Manhattan, Hooded Justice, Lord Jupiter, and goes in a very interesting and unexpected direction with them is to its credit. And the fact that you get to find out Hooded Justice's true identity and his life and see what a Dr. Manhattan dildo looks like are enough reason for me and for you to invest 9 hours of your time. Plus, it cleaned up on Emmy Awards too.